A very good day to you and welcome to this week's edition of What's Not Making Headlines. I'm your host, Ananda Khomo. Now, this show focuses on significant stories which are often not given much attention in mainstream news. And don't forget that at home during the show, you can call in and tell us what you think should have been making headlines this week. Now, the number to dial there is 011 542 1046, and you can share your views on any of the stories you feel comfortable with sharing. Now, the first story we're looking at today is the 2018 BRICS Media Forum Action Plan, recently held in Cape Town. Now, it has been hailed as a success. The two-day conference was attended by leaders of 38 mainstream media organizations from BRICS countries and other African countries. Now, the conference came ahead of the 10th BRICS Summit taking place this coming week. BRICS Business Council Chairman Dr. Iqbal Survey said that this year's forum was important in promoting personal exchanges and mutual learning among BRICS media outlets. Now, the conference was held in conjunction with China's Xinhua News Agency and Independent Media. Now, in studio, we always have somebody joining us to just help us unpack these issues. And today we have journalist and the CEO of BLQ Media, Mashudu Malema. A very warm welcome to you, Mashudu. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, let's touch on the story that I've just spoken about, the BRICS media story. Now, your take on this initiative of basically bringing the BRICS countries together in terms of journalism and media coverage. What's your take on it?
Personally, I think that it's something that's long overdue. I do think that it's incredibly important, especially when it comes to the way that reporting is picked up by foreign publications, So I think that it's very important, especially for journalists from BRICS countries, to really control the narrative of how, developing countries are actually portrayed, especially in international media. So when you look at the action plan really that's being proposed is really taking journalists through training, really taking them through workshops, just equipping them with the skills, especially in this day and age of digital media, just really equipping them with the skills to really report accurately and responsibly. And I think there's a bit of a difference in the way that, particularly in South Africa, there's a bit of a difference in the way that we report the news. It takes to really have a very negative connotation, and it's really counterproductive when we look at investment, for instance. If every single headline, every single day really is focusing on corruption, and that's the sentiment that is then picked up by foreign publication, it becomes a problem when looking at investment and how possible and prospective investors are then looking at South Africa. It really tends to make them a little more cautious. So I think that it is important to train journalists to report responsibly and accurately, but not overly emphasize on a negative sentiment when it comes to reporting on the country.
Okay. Now let's talk about an incident that comes to mind when it comes to reporting and how much coverage certain countries, let's say, massacres and disasters get. I mean, I'll use the example of the Charlie Hebdo incident in France.
Yes.
And not much later that year, we saw the massacre at Garissa University in Kenya. I mean, if you compare those two stories, I mean, the amount of coverage the shooting of those 12 people got with international leaders staging a march, and it got coverage, a lot of coverage. But now 147 people killed in Kenya at that university didn't get much coverage.
You're absolutely right. And this was actually brought up, I think, by one of the agencies at the actual action plan two-day conference. I think it was actually brought up by one of the news agencies in Russia, or one of the editors of a news agency rather in Russia, saying that we're not prioritized. So because we're not prioritized, we need to take initiative ourselves to make sure that when we do report, we report in a way that foreign news outlets are forced then to have to, to actually have to pick up the stories. Because if we ourselves take the initiative of making sure that these are front page stories, it puts them in a position where they actually have to pay attention to us. He was talking a lot about this one particular journalist or editor was mentioning how, during the apartheid years and when Nelson Mandela was incarcerated, there was a period where the world actually thought he had died because there was no coverage. So it really is important for our journalists to really run with stories and run them in a way that it forces, the international community to really look at us.
And then questions will be raised on why they're not latching onto the stories.
Exactly. If we are then
big.
providing the news wires or the international news wires with the stories that they need to cover.
And one last question before we move on to our next story. I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you about the state of journalism in South Africa currently.
I think it echoes the sentiment that I just, what I just said now about it being very negative.
Yeah.
And I think it's a problem. It is a problem. I mean, on one hand, yes, we need to report the news. But on the other hand, if you look at, let's say, other developed countries and you look at the news that makes headlines there, you'll find that maybe even if there is, and it's not to say that there isn't corruption in other countries, but you'll find maybe when they do report on corruption, it's maybe on page 6. It's not really a front page type of headline. So I think with us, I think it goes back to being responsible in the way that we report. Yes, let's be accurate, but let's also not just bombard, just the audience, and let's not bombard, whether it's the international audience or it's domestic, let's just not continuously use that negative narrative when reporting on South Africa, because it affects foreign investment. It affects so much.
It does. And I remember a couple of years ago, the SABC came up with an initiative to have a good,
yes,
a sunshine story type of thing, because I think the negativity...
And they just really wanted to balance that. And it's important to have balanced news.
Most definitely, most definitely. Now we move on to other news. A Christian writer and public speaker has been ordered to make amendments to her book titled Leefslim vir Seuns. Now, Greta Wid was told to edit parts in her book that are said to have violated the rights of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer and intersex community. Now, Wid signed a settlement after an intervention by the South African Human Rights Commission. Wid wrote that, amongst other things, that when fathers do not love their sons or constantly beat and humiliate them, this could lead to their sons becoming gay. Now, Wid's statements on homosexuality sparked a heated argument on social media platforms. Let's talk about this one. I mean, we're saying much too many incidents of, let's say, pastors or religious leaders using the platform that they have to just basically help me out, speak negatively about the choices of some people or their lifestyle or, in this case, homosexuality. I mean, what Livda is saying is definitely to be condemned.
I understand completely, and I do agree with you. And I think it's very tricky because on one hand, yes, we do have freedom of speech. Obviously this is enshrined in the Constitution. But also I think what is also really enshrined in the Constitution is the fact that your human rights or your access of human rights should not infringe on anybody else's, and I think that it's a very delicate balance, but if you are then imposing your beliefs on another human being, it becomes a problem, and that's not the country that we live in. So I mean, it's tricky. I suppose it boils down to personal opinion, but personal opinion should not, overrule other people's, let's say, sense of, there's a word that I'm looking for, other people's comfortability or other people's basic human rights. It shouldn't infringe on that. And I think, especially in a day where, or especially in the age that we're living in, where there's so much violence against, people in the community, and it's or raping or corrective raping. It's very irresponsible, I think, to then put out such sentiments out there.
Exactly, and to think that she has been actually speaking to young, impressionable
I was shocked.
Children.
I was shocked. In high schools.
Exactly, and this started way back in 1996. She's been giving these public talks and these workshops at these schools. I mean, how was that not picked up on? I mean, we'll come to the fact that she released the book and republished
in
the
2017.
Book in 2017,
yes.
And it wasn't picked up on.
I mean, it's problematic. It really is problematic because, I mean, this is just one case that's been picked up. How do we know what's really going on in our schools? I mean, how do we start? Because, I mean, obviously, motivational speakers are invited into schools all the time, but is there a vetting process? Are we sure that the message that this particular person who's going to be addressing very impressionable children, are we sure that this is the type of message that is responsible? And I think we need to look at that, and schools really need to take accountability for that.
Most definitely. And we have a caller on the line. We've got Witten calling us from Cape Town. A very good day to you, Witten. What's on your mind?
Dave, ma'am, there is a statement. Hello?
Hi, go ahead, Witten.
Hi, there is a statement that somebody once made. It takes 1,000 years to speak the truth. And takes 10 days to accept a lie. My question then is, why is that? Many years ago, journalism was number one. Today, it seems to have lost its cause, it's lost its path. And when I listen to people speaking, I ask myself, when they speak, where did they get that information from? Because somewhere we all have learned something. What are we really learning today through the media? And is the media speaking the truth? My question.
Very good question indeed, Witten. Thank you so much for your contribution to our conversation. Our speaker there, our viewer there, Witten, calling us from Cape Town. Basically going back to the conversation we had about the media and the type of messages that the media seeks to what's the word I'm looking for? Yeah, get out there. And would you like to respond to Witten just quickly?
I just think it's funny when he talks about what is the role. I think that's a genuine question. Or really the premise of his question. And I think, for instance, you look at this particular story and the media coverage that it has received, albeit little, but you look at the media coverage that it has actually received, you know, and I think it's important then, you can't then say that journalism, or let's just say media, doesn't have a role to play, because we are talking about this particular situation now because it was actually put in a publication. So I do think that when he asked about the role of the media, I'm not really sure what he means, because in this particular story that we're really talking about, it's because had it not been published, we would not have been speaking on this.
But another thing it goes to say, because on this particular show, we're talking about stories that haven't gotten the kind of traction in mainstream news. And I think that plays in very importantly, because of the story that we're talking about of this writer and her publishing of the books and the things she says about homosexuality and the thing, it was picked up on social media. The conversation started on social media. And since then...
It was only picked up by a local, a small, really, relatively small publication.
Very small publication. And that ties in with Witten's question on what is then the role of the media. Because we're also looking at places where the social media seems to be pushing this kind of stories that we're covering. Talk to me on that.
Also, remember, I think we touched on this a little earlier when speaking on the action plan, you know, and the discussion that was actually had, that we need to get to a point where we are now training journalists to really report in a digital age. Because now you're talking a lot about social media. And a lot of stories, yes, will get picked up on social media. Racism stories will get picked up a lot on social media and then gain traction from that. So if we get to the point where there are training facilities for journalists, particularly when it comes to reporting digitally or being able to spot news digitally, I think we're going to be so much better. Let's say, I think we're going to be so much better as media in this country, you know, because then we are equipped to actually be able to pick up these stories and pick them up relatively quickly and not necessarily just allow social media to control the narrative.
Definitely. Now we move on to our next story. South Africans have until mid-August to comment on the proposed new tobacco control bill. Now, the proposed tobacco control bill has caused uproar as it suggests a jail time for persons who smoke in public. It also recommends that people smoking in cars with passengers under the age of 18 could face jail time. The proposed bill will also make it illegal for restaurants, pubs and clubs to have designated smoking areas inside. Furthermore, smoking inside any building will be prohibited, as will smoking in certain outdoor spaces such as beaches and sports stadiums. And the bill also holds property owners responsible for anyone smoking on their property. Now, joining us on the line is the Executive Director of the Free Market Foundation, Leon Louw. A very good day to you, Leon. Tell us, what's your take on this bill?
Well, good morning to you, or good afternoon, sorry, to you and the listeners. It's actually such a bizarre piece of law that nobody could possibly support it if they've read it. The only way you can think it's a good idea is that you haven't actually bothered to read it. And I'm sorry to say that applies to every member of the Cabinet. This has been approved by the Cabinet. I cannot believe any of them took the trouble to read it, because it's such obvious nonsense in so many ways. Let me give you an example.
Please do.
Its effect is that smoking in a place like Alex Township, which is near to where you and I both are now, would be illegal anywhere. You wouldn't possibly be able to smoke lawfully in Alex. And for that matter, in any informal settlement or any what we call a township or location. So this is an elitist, anti-poor, and in South Africa that means anti-black and anti-transformation measure. You would effectively not be able to smoke or trade tobacco products in a predominantly black or high-density area of South Africa. That is how mad it is. Someone living in Alex would have to get in a taxi, drive to somewhere where they can find effectively a private property on which somebody will allow them to smoke, and that property will have to be a very rich person with a big enough garden to be able to smoke away from, for example, a window or a door. And so, yes, I can go on. It is just completely nuts. This finally reveals the true agenda of anti-smoking fanatics. They hate the fact that human beings might enjoy themselves, might have satisfaction. They think of you and me and every viewer as a piece of meat that they are going to keep healthy regardless of the fact that we have a mind and a lifestyle, choices, and private property.
All right. I think, Leon, for the benefit of our viewers, I think Leon is touching on the fact that you're, under this bill, smoking will be prohibited 5 meters away from any open door or any open window. And this is where he talks about informal settlement, where the spaces in between are so small. What's your view? What's your view?
Personally, I have read the proposed bill. I will say that I find it to be extreme, I mean, to the point where people will be looking at actual jail time, a year or two jail time if they're found guilty. So I do feel that from that perspective, it is very extreme. But then I just think maybe to really not be biased or to really maybe just counter that, and maybe to really look at why the government really wants to implement such a bill. I think a recent study by the World Health Organization indicated that about 600,000 people die every year due to secondhand smoke. And of that 600,000, I think 165,000 are children and minors. So, I mean, on one level, I mean, at least consider the fact that the government is trying to be responsible in preventing such unnecessary deaths, and also he touched on this maybe being a little too elitist. But countries like Canada have very similar bills. They've got a very strict bill. Australia as well. So I'm not really sure if we can say, that this is something that's very elitist, or it's really just really trying to get to a point where people who don't smoke are not being made to suffer for people who are.
All right. Mr. Leon, if you can just stay on the line for us. We have a caller who'd like to engage with us on one of the stories we've covered. We've got Uzama on the line. Zama, a very good day to you. What's on your mind?
Hello, Sisinjana.
Hi, Sikwana Sisinjana.
Ngiyaphila. Engithanda ukusho or ukubonga nge-Afro View ingendlela engireporta ngayo manje, since it is Afro View, indlela engireporta ngayo nangendlela i-breaking news esheshe ivele ngayo. Nje yonke uhlelo lweni lu-up to date kuya enjoye ngisho ukubuka le ekhaya. Benkela nje bandashela ukuthi niqhubeke nisebenze njalo nelokhuzana ilo i-multi-choice iqhubeke whatever deal or contract ezokwenzeka. Sazi ukuthi leli opportunity ngingayithola because siyayidinga iningi njenganani. Nje ngiyabonga nje i-breaking news. If istory senzeka it's breaking news and si-accurate uyasibona yonke into niyasilandela siyakwazi ukulokhuzana uku-understanda leyo nto enzani leso sikhathi. Ngicela nje ukubonga umsebenzi eniwenzayo.
Siyabonga.
Uqhubeka phambili.
Siyabonga kakhulu, Zama. That was Uzama there. Just basically talking about the kind of coverage that has become known about Afro Worldview. Very thank you showing us support for our news coverage. Going back to our story, the tobacco bill. Mr. Leon, if you can still hear me. So what do you make of the other restrictions? So now you've mentioned the 5 meters away from any open window, any open door. What are the of these prohibitions, if I can put it that way, do you have a problem with as Free Market Foundation? Hi, Mr. We seem to have lost Mr. Leon there. Now, talking to the secondhand smoke by children, I mean, I don't know how many incidents I've come across where you'll find there's somebody, and it's usually the males who are driving, and there's little kids in there, and they're just smoking freely. I mean, that for me is a major concern.
And it is, because on one hand, yes, it's frowned upon. It's considered a taboo, obviously, to smoke in front of children, but it's not illegal. So, I mean, at what point then do we then say, okay, because this is happening, let's then maybe put a law attached to it, which will force people to take responsibility for the manner in which they smoke. So I don't know. I feel like it's debatable, really. I do personally think that the let's say the consequences, you know, of, let's say, the going against the laws should the bill be passed. I feel it is really extreme. But also, at what end then do we continuously allow, like the incidents that you just mentioned now, for children to really be suffering because adults refuse to be, let's say, responsible in the way that they choose to smoke?
Exactly. Now, that is the Tobacco Control Bill, which people have until the 10th of August to make their submissions on it. And the email there is lynn, L-Y-N-N, .moeng, MOENG, at health.gov.za. Use that email to make your submissions on this particular bill. Now, moving on elsewhere on the continent, Zimbabwe's president is trying to rally white minority voters as the race to this month's historic elections draw closer. President Emmerson Mnangagwa held a whites interface rally at Borrowdale Race Course yesterday. Now, Mr. Mnangagwa told a meeting in the capital, Harare, that the era of land seizures from white farmers is over. The land grabs under former leader Robert Mugabe were deeply unpopular and contributed to the economic collapse of the once prosperous country. Now, Mashudu, what do you make of this particular story?
I think it's very tactical on his part. I think it's very necessary to really change the narrative of Botswana. If you remember at the World Economic Forum earlier this year, he was really adamant that Zimbabwe is open for business. And that was what he wanted investors, that is what he wanted the world to know. So you can only really do that if there's a distance from, let's say, the previous regime. And it's a little ironic because he was Mugabe's enforcer, you know, and he's now really done a 180, you know, with the policies that existed then and with where the government is going now. But if he does want to get Zimbabwe, and if the government does want to get Zimbabwe to a position where there actually is investment flowing into the country, he needs to appear to at least have done a bit of a turnaround compared to, you know, in regards to policies that existed when Mugabe was still in power.
Yeah, and now a little bit later on during this conversation, we'll be joined by a journalist from Zimbabwe, Uzenzele Ndebele. But before we get him on the line, now it's been reported that the race there is pretty hectic, with just 3% between Mr. Mnangagwa, the ZANU-PF, and Mr. Nelson Chamisa. What do you make of that?
It's very interesting because Chamisa has really gotten the youth support, a lot of youth support. So when you look at that, maybe Mnangagwa, where he is, he's sort of thinking that, listen, because they already have a lot of youth support, maybe let's try a different tactic. Because previously white farmers didn't vote for ZANU-PF. So I think it's tactical, like I said, for him to put himself in a position where now they're trying to garner that type of vote. You know, obviously bearing in mind the fact that the youth vote is predominantly with the opposition.
Most definitely. And now joining us on the phone is Zimbabwean journalist Zenzele Ndebele. Very good afternoon to you. Ndebele, now tell us very briefly about this particular rally seeking to court, if I can put it that way, the white minority vote.
Yes. Well, it's, you know, the Mnangagwa is trying to do, or is pretending to do something different from what Robert Mugabe was doing. Over the years, basically, ZANU-PF has alienated the white vote by, you know, accusing them of supporting the opposition, taking the farms from them and all those kind of things. And, you know, Mnangagwa is desperate for legitimacy, is desperate for capital, and he knows the only way or the only place where he can get capital without serious conditions is the Western countries. And without the support of the white people in Zimbabwe, he really feels like he will not get the support of the European Union, the Americans, and get that money. So he's looking for the vote, but more importantly, he's looking for money because ZANU-PF is desperate to get money to revive the economy. So we should look at this thing as, he's planning post-elections, that if he can bring the white community on board, probably they will value more investors. He might also get them to go back to some of the farms and try and revive the economy, because Zimbabwe is an agro-based economy, and without production in farms, the economy will never click.
Now, tell us about how this has been received, especially by the staunch ZANU-PF supporters there. What is the talk around this rally?
Well, there are mixed feelings. There are people who are excited about, Emmerson Mnangagwa meeting white people. But there are some people who are saying that, look, these are the guys a few years ago who were actually saying Morgan Tsvangirai is a T-boy, he's a sellout, he's trying to sell the country to the whites. They even came up with slogans like Zimbabwe will never be a colony again. And they're doing exactly the thing that they were trying to, discourage Morgan Tsvangirai from doing. But that image at the rally of a white guy being served a tea by a black man, it's something else. I don't know. When people are desperate for votes, they will do anything.
All right. Thank you so much, Zenzele. Because of time issues, unfortunately, we can't get into more news coming from Zimbabwe just days ahead of the elections. We know that they're having these elections on the 30th of July. We'll be covering that, rather, in our news coverage during the week leading up to that day. Now, our last story for this afternoon, the Yemen Republic has praised the support they received from Arab Coalition. This following the recent Houthi coup. Now, the Arab Coalition launched a major military and humanitarian aid operation in western Yemen in June. The objective was to ensure adequate supply of humanitarian aid to the Yemeni people. President Abdrabbu Mansur Hadi stressed the importance of strengthening cooperation and integration between his country and the Arab Coalition. Let's talk about this. I know this is a story you feel strongly about. You've been following it for years.
I do.
I think before we get into it, if you can just, for the sake of our viewers who are not clued up on the story, just a brief history regarding this.
So this began about 3 years ago. The Arab Coalition being in Yemen. And this was at the invitation of the current president, or the legitimate government of Yemen, requesting assistance from the Arab Coalition in order to deal with Houthi rebels and militia who were in support of the former president. So this has then brought a lot of tension and a lot of infighting within the country. So the point where the Arab Coalition actually got to the point where they were now in Yemen was, like I said, it was at the invitation of the Yemeni government. But this has still been controversial because when you look at just the two factions that are sort of really battling it out in Yemen, you find the Houthi rebels who are, well, it's alleged that they are then being supported and funded by Iran. And then when you look at the government of Yemen, who's then fighting off this militia, who is obviously, like I said, being supported by the Arab Coalition. And the Arab Coalition is made up of about 9 countries within the Middle East and parts of Africa. Within Africa, it's Morocco and Somalia, I believe, who are in the actual Arab Coalition. So, like I said, it has been a very debatable and a very contentious, topic, obviously, particularly in the media and the way that it's reported. You find very recently Amnesty International released a report saying that there were human rights violations on the part of the Arab Coalition, with particular reference to the UAE. Saying that there were secret prisons of civilians being tortured, etc. But now the UAE has really come strongly against that, vehemently denying that, saying that if let's say such a thing does exist, they're saying that it doesn't, but they've actually called on the Yemeni government to conduct an independent investigation into these allegations, saying that Amnesty International's accusations are politically motivated. So it's a very interesting type of story, but a lot of coverage is really against the coalition, which is funny to me, because when you want to look at it from an objective point of view, and you look at facts, for instance, the UAE has, or the Arab Coalition has, I think, poured about $4 billion dollars into humanitarian aid to actually assist civilians on the ground. So I just think that it's a very interesting topic, but it's also, in a lot of reporting, it tends to be very biased. So from someone who's been just sort of looking at the situation and the way that the narrative has been portrayed, against, let's say, against the Arab coalition, I find that a lot of these allegations are really baseless.
I'll be following that story from now on. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we're out of time, so we can't dedicate a bit more time to that story. And that's where we leave it for today. Interesting analysis from our guest there. And of course, we do appreciate your views at home. Do join us again next week as we explore and give you more news which did not get much coverage by the mainstream media. A very big thank you to you, Mashudu Malema. Goodbye.